let's get started. How to align your test data to your evolving center of excellence. I imagine a lot of the people here today that are struggling with test data bottlenecks and compliance risks, and if so, they're in the right place, as today, Curiosity and TestRail will show you how to align your data. So with me today, we have two exceptional speakers, Chris Faraglia and Huw Price. Chris Faraglia is the lead solution architect at TestRail. Chris possesses extensive expertise in software engineering, technical product management, and senior QA testing roles within highly regulated domains, including commercial nuclear power and healthcare. At TestRail, Chris leverages his technical knowledge to drive the adoption and optimization of testing frameworks while supporting teams in achieving their quality assurance objective. And from the Curiosity software side, we have our co-founder and chairman, Huw Price. Described as the godfather of test data, Huw is a serial test data inventor and has worked with the world's largest organizations to transform their test data management. And now with Curiosity, he crafts innovative solutions for test data and quality success, empowering enterprises to thrive by overcoming the challenges of complexity, legacy, scale, and regulation. And hopefully, we'll be showing both TestRail and Curiosity's approach to test data management today. But yeah, thank you for joining. But before I get into it, I did want to get your opinion and insight on the poll that we are currently running. So the poll asks, how often do you encounter delays in your release cycles due to test data? And I see that 45% have answered occasionally, and 27% answered rarely or never, and 18% answered almost always, and 9% answered frequently so far. But Huw, from your experience working with enterprises, how often do you find that they find delays due to test data?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is that test data can take up to about 40% of developers or testers' times. They don't realize they're actually, preparing environments, looking for data, hunting for data, trying to find bug data. A developer may be fiddling around editing data, changing a value to a flag, so you go down a different path in the code, etc. You may actually be waiting for data. If you've got a transformation, an ETL transformation, they tend to be broken up in different stages. And if you're waiting for the upstream people, then that's a problem. Also, you've got version issues in that, when we think of data, we think of APIs, and an API is a payload. And if someone's changed the definition of that and you don't have the data in the columns that you're expecting, then that's a data issue. It's not an API issue. So it's sort of a little bit of a hidden problem, really, and that's kind of the issue. I think the other thing, of course, is that we now live in such a vastly more complex world. Lots of ERPs, lots of cloud, lots of legacy systems, lots of data being basically pieces of string going backwards and forwards, historical data which doesn't match with sort of current data, and then you chuck in the wonderful world of LLMs, which everyone's jumping up and down about. So suddenly trying to manage that data estate or even understand it is actually a fairly gargantuan task, really. And it's just getting way, way, way worse. So, I've been in the game for a long time. Mainframe's pretty easy to deal with. 3-tier architecture is pretty easy to deal with. But now we're into this kind of heterogeneous world, where you've got products like Neptune appearing, you've got graph databases, all of which have their own particular data requirements to be able to do that. If you're dealing with a single app and you understand it pretty well, your life's probably relatively easy. But that's not really the way of most, medium to large enterprises nowadays.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And Chris, I'd love to get your expertise and insight here on the question as well. The question was, how often do you encounter delays in your release cycles due to test data, with 43% saying occasionally, 7% frequently, and 21% almost always finding delays? Is that something you find as well with the customers you work with or organizations?
Yeah, I think so. From my perspective, both personally and then also what we see a lot for TestRail as we onboard customers, and I think it's just a general trend. Test data really becomes more and more valuable and more important not just for individual test frameworks, but actually for release cycles and teams, as teams try to really scale. That's one area that we find that I think we see a lot of teams hit is whenever they reach a lot of thresholds where teams that may have small automated suites or even manual test sets, this may work for a given point in time, and maybe the test data is not very good. Maybe it is not, really doesn't enrich the set or get the coverage that they want, and the teams maybe augment some way. But if they have large actual like enterprise level products that they're testing or integrating with, a lot of times these things are exposed whenever test data sets are inadequate. When teams are really trying to do this at scale, again, across platforms, large enterprise settings, and this absolutely is something that can delay releases, or really on the worst side of it is identify and expose more post-deployment defects and bugs, right, due to lack of actually testing. So it's definitely something that I've seen and experienced, and I think that is pretty common, Mantis.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's a really good answer. But yeah, I think now let's hand it over to you, Huw and Chris, for the main topic today. And I believe, Huw, you might be sharing your screen.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to sort of jump back and forth between myself and Chris, but I'm going to kind of start off a little bit, and Chris, feel free to jump in wherever you want, and then we'll kind of talk about. I'll probably show some of the integration that that's been around for a while, and I'll show you some of it working, etc., between Curiosity and TestRail, and then we'll talk about TestRail and kind of wrap it all up a little bit at the end. So just to kind of talk about kind of the test data and TestRail. So basically, we're all about kind of the automated test data provisioning, continuous artifact creation. This ability to create the test cases with the matching data, the automation scripts, and also the being able to dynamically create the right test data to drive those automation scripts. Maybe one of the better questions would have been, how robust are your automation frameworks? Because most of them tend to start falling down because of data errors and not because of bugs within the system. A big one is obviously regulatory compliance. I'll talk about that a little bit. And accelerating testing cycles. You really should be moving towards sort of continuous deployment really nowadays. And to do that, you need to dynamically create tests, based on the changes, the requirement changes, and the code changes that have come in. Move out to having automated tests and the appropriate data to test them, and then push those out, through a DevOps chain, into Canary deployments, and then out into the real world, etc. So that's kind of the mission statement of what we're up to. So just the hidden challenges I sort of talked about a little bit. I mean, it's always whenever you talk to CIOs, QA managers, etc. Test data is always the second most important thing. It never makes it to the top, but it's consistently up there. And as I said before, it's a lot to do with the actual amount of time that is wasted fiddling around, and it's very unstructured fiddling. You've got a 3-week sprint, and suddenly you're spending 2 weeks of that actually preparing some complicated long chain histories, and actually spending 1 week, sort of 3 days coding and 2 weeks messing about with data. The next sprint, you might spend no time messing about with the data and just be, worrying about some UI changes. So it's the measurability of it, something. There's a big thing that we spend an awful lot of time doing, which is basically coverage. Coverage, again, is a much maligned subject. People say, 100 tests. How many worked? 100. What coverage? You've got 100%. Completely wrong. Basically, what you're talking about there is, it's requirements coverage that you're after. Code coverage is a different story. So this idea of being able to create the data to make sure that you are actually covering higher amounts of code. You'd be lucky to get 20% code coverage, closer to 60 to 80%. And to do that, you are going to need kind of some modeling and coverage, understanding of coverage. The other big one is recreating bugs. you know, you get an urgent bug, something's fallen over in production, you then fiddle about trying to create data in development, whereas what we can do is actually suck the data out of production, mask it, assign a set of new keys, maybe create 40 or 50 examples of it, and then that can then be automatically used by the developers to test that that bug has actually been fixed in the development environment, and get that patch into development as soon as possible. A lot of teams spend time waiting for data, especially for very large projects where you've got lots of integrated, you know, you can't really do your new business intelligence dashboard or your new AI, LLM without actually having the data ready for you. So people spend a lot of time waiting. Whereas if you have a nice, efficient test data team, again, a very small team, you should be able to actually provision data to teams so they can start working and they can crack on with stuff. Inconsistent or incomplete data, if you've got more than one environment, trying to get them aligned can be quite hard work. And then the other ones are the different types of testing, unit testing, functional testing. The big one nowadays is integration testing, and that's really where you're trying to isolate certain endpoints and test things thoroughly, and to make sure that when you create Kafka messages that they're actually not going to bounce back because they don't match with the broker code or the payment or the payment rules or something like that. Big one, regulatory requirements. I mean, I am still staggered at the amount of production data that is used in development. It's a crime. It is actually a crime to be able to have that data. There is very, very limited masking that goes on, and if you look at the kind of science of masking, it's you know, you really need to think about you know, the categorization of data, changing amounts, you know, all sorts of much deeper masking. And you know, the effect of poorly masked data in development is basically you're giving away the farm to, you know, a temp who could come in and go in through the front end and basically run any report they want. It's on sort of pseudo masked data, but that data is extremely valuable to your competitors. That data can be allowed you to, you know, held to ransom, etc., etc. And you know, you spend all this money on your security systems, and then you basically chuck the data over to a fairly unregulated environment without the same security protocols. So just to kind of give you a flavor for you guys who haven't really heard of us, we've been around for a very long time in the test data space. The team actually really started back in the 80s. Most of you probably weren't even born then, but we've been working with data in terms of data quality, data validation, data analysis for a very, very long time. The approach that we use is kind of discover, act, monitor, and that's really spend an awful lot of time scanning your data, scanning your structures, you know, and basically the stuff that is, we automate as much of this as possible. We can then act upon that. We can, you know, notify you there's been changes. We can set up masking rules for you to say that this data needs to be masked. This is problematic. It's being used in the development environment, you know, with your monitoring. And then we have a whole series of kind of act. And these actions allow you to mask, create, model, you know, design data and push that data into the TestRail frameworks so that you can then run your manual and automated tests there. So that's really the kind of the core platform. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly run through about 5 different features of the product. Okay, so just quickly run through those slides, and then I'll get into the TestRail things. Now, within our framework, we actually have 20, 30, 40 different types of things that you do, and that's the real issue with test data, is there's so much to it. You know, it's not just I need a bit of data through the front end. You know, you've got data flowing across Kafka messages into legacy systems and in and out. Now, the very first thing that we do is that we build a corporate dictionary of your data. We're kind of a very odd industry in that, you know, if you go in and say, well, tell me all your data, the structures of it, the relationships between it, some examples of content, and for example, tell me where all my personal data is held within an organization. There is no standard corporate dictionary that exists. There are some open source tools which are actually quite good, but they're very poorly used. And most people don't really, you know, have sort of an incentive to use them. Whereas what we've done is we've basically have this continuous monitoring of all of your data structures. They do not just have to be databases. They can be non-structured data, they can be JSON, they can be XML, they can be messages, and also they can be API payloads, because that is really how a lot of data flows around now between systems. And what we're looking for is data growth and categorization. So we're looking to see if, as data is growing within your environments, any structure changes. People will introduce structure changes into development environments. Now, the teams that are using those API structures, or maybe using some of the messages, are interested in those, and knowing about them earlier rather than before they sort of make it into production is interesting. Continuous scanning and categorization. PII stands for personally identifiable information. And then the other one is documentation. With the advent of AI, we can actually go in now and keep all of your structures up to date. And what we'll do is just point the AI engine at your Jiras, your Confluences, whatever you've got, and we will then keep those up to date, which previously just didn't exist. It was just too hard, and I was guilty as anyone in that I just never really got back to actually documenting up those tables. What does that look like? If you look. So here's our tool. Here we've got lots of different structures. These are currently some databases. We have all the message structures in here as well. And if we go and look at the insights, so what we've got here running, we've got all the various different scans that are running automatically. We're looking at sensitive, non-sensitive data. We've identified 30 sensitive columns in this particular structure, which we need to mask. From that, we can then set up we can act on that and create some masking algorithms, which would then be applied to them and pushed in. We can see who's active within the product, using it to see what's going on. And then we've got various different activities. Again, these are actions that we can perform on it. We've also got this idea of data quality. So we would be automatically scanning the data to see if there's any bad data within your databases, and that's very useful. Again, you could add that into your TestRail as a kind of an actual result. We ran some tests. Let's validate the database. Did you break anything in the data? All of these are the types of things with this kind of discover, act, monitor. A lot of this is driven by our AI engines, and we have lots and lots of kind of agents that you can set up to invoke, and those would just sit there running away, and you'll just get an email or a Slack message or whatever it is telling you what's happened. You've added some new data. We scanned it. We reckon this is PII data. Okay. A lot of this, when we talk about AI is really good at actually doing a lot of the boring stuff. And this actually is really one of the really good uses of AI, in that, you've already done the work by putting it into Jira. So why the hell not? Let's let AI go and do the hard yards of scraping it and putting it in. So that's actually a very useful thing. Another one is gathering up your test data. Chances are you will already be doing some good stuff in your test data world. You might be generating, you might already have some homegrown masking. You've got some DBA utilities that you run to provision environments. You've got some ETL tools, some Informatica, whatever, and you've got some Python, and you use ChatGPT to create something useful. Now, that's all very well and good, but it tends to be a bit fragmented and not really under control. Whereas what we do is say, well, great, let's go submit a job. And we've got all sorts of different things that we can do, and we gather them up into a central portal. And that portal is extremely powerful. You can build very sophisticated forms. Depending on what you've entered, you would get different drop downs and different things happening. But if we go here, basically I can come in, I've got my drop downs, I can look up data in the back. Here I want to create some data. And in this case, what I also want to do is I want to create a virtual response. I talked about integrated testing before. Here I'm going to create some actual live data into my dev database with these scenarios. And then I want a purchase order in my response from the shipping system. So that will create the various customers, and it will also create a virtual response from the shipping system saying that the PO, it'll create a purchase order message within there. So that in effect allows us to build a little bit of integrated data at the same time. We fire that off, and that will then return, let you know when it's finished. It's created some data, and now it's creating the virtual data in the virtual environment for you. Okay. So gathering stuff up. Now, why do you want to do that? It's because you can measure it. If everyone's just kind of doing their own thing and it breaks, you've no idea what people are requesting. You've no idea what your automation is requesting. And also, if you get an error, you don't really track it centrally. So this is really kind of a good place to start. Again, we're probably talking 1 week's work to do that one and that one, and suddenly you've got a lot more control of your data environments. Now, for people who are, probably a lot of testers here, one of the things here is this idea of finding data. If you ask people what they spend most of their time doing is trying to find data to run a particular test case, whether that's a manual or an automated one. And what we do is we've created what we call a find and allocating data. So we will create a set of forms. You fill in the forms with the way you want. We then go off behind the scenes. We construct the queries to go and look for that data for you, so you don't have to bother. We will then go off, find you the data, and then we have this concept of allocation. Now, the allocation basically is saying, do you want this key to be allocated just to you? Because you get this cannibalization problem where people are using each other's data, or they've suddenly closed a transaction. We came across it the other day with a big telco, and we were dealing with one account or asset, and someone, we had no idea where went in and it changed it completely, messing everything up. So again, that's pretty straightforward. This is a find. You click on execute. You say, how many orders do you want? I want a couple of cancelled. Give me more than 4 items, and I need a couple of salespeople. We will then go off and fire off a request for you. We will also say, how long do you want to reserve this for? So we want to reserve it for 10 days, and we keep track of all of the requests that are coming in. Over here, you'll see the queries that have been constructed, and these are the keys that have been allocated, and these are the dates that they're allocated to. Sounds simple, but it's actually extremely useful. If you've got more than about 5 or 6 people in the team, it's definitely a very useful thing to have. Designing your data and tests with modeling. Now, I'm not sure whether you guys have got into the wonderful world of modeling. You might be familiar with things like BPMN, etc. And actually, what I'll probably use this actually as an opportunity to show the integration with TestRail. So here, what we've done is we've got some models. Now, let's just minimize those down a second. Start again. So we've got a couple of models and submodels. Let me just relay that out. So somewhere over here is this. We're going to do in login, and we can do withdrawal. And what we've done here is we just basically build a business process model of, sometimes it can be a data flow, it can be the different types of data that you, the actual action within a UI or an API. And here we're doing this. And what we're doing here is we're actually then building all the various different positive and negative scenarios. And everyone can kind of, it's very useful to get an agreement on what things should look like, okay? Each one of these is a different path through the data. And as you click through it, I'm just getting a little slight performance, oops. If you click through this, you'll see the different scenarios that are being tested, like so. Okay, and that's this idea of modeling out the variations of data is really useful, and it is this is where you drive your coverage up, and you drive your coverage up both in the number of test cases, because a lot of test cases are actually very, very similar. People tend to copy them and make a small change, whereas with this approach, you can model the variations of data. Obviously, we can push them into TestRail, but at the same time, we can also create the back-end data of this along with it. Now, delivering the data you need, let's just have a little final look at this. And what this is, this allows you to, so here within the tool, we've got this ability to create a pipeline, and a pipeline allows you to do pretty much anything you like with data. We would have a form linked with it. And in this particular case, I've got all sorts of different ways that I can create data. I could just go and fill my parameters in, or I could use a model. And the model is actually then just going to actually model out the variations of data that I need to create, and it would create the data associated with the model. I might want to use something like, I think, like all pairs, or I could maybe compare the differences between environments. So if you look here, you'll see we've got a pre-prod environment, which has all of the pre-prod types of data, and we've got our development environment. And what I'm actually trying to do is to make sure that our development environment data has the pre-prod characteristics plus a lot more. So your development data should always be richer than your production data. And what you can do is compare them and say, we don't have one of that type of data, we don't have that type of data, that type of data. So what I'm going to do is just publish the data that's missing in my development environment. So when I run my batch job or my end of month close, I will have all of the same production characteristics of the data that exists. So carrying on a little bit, the next thing I was going to show you how the TestRail integration goes, and then I'll bring in young Chris. So if you look at this test, where we go, digital banking, we've got this ability we have all our different test scenarios, and if we go and look at our automation, there we go, and we go out to TestRail. We're going to check into an existing folder, select the folder we want, TestRail, demo, whatever. I think this was this one. And that would then push them out into TestRail. And if we're going to have a look in TestRail over here, you'll see these are the test cases that we've created. They've been pushed out. Here you'll see information that has been set from our world. So we've come in, we may have looked some of these values up from a back-end database, but they end up in the TestRail framework. And obviously TestRail has a data framework as well. In this case, we just push them directly into the test cases themselves. But typically we would more likely to be pushing it into the data driving for the test cases. Also, you'll see that we synchronize back the results. So over here, we can see that actually, I think we may have a failure. Let's have a look. Yeah, that one failed. So that's failed. So now we know that something in here is that, and we can then just look at the model within here and see, well, why is that failed? What's the logical thing? Is it a requirements problem, a code problem, or a data problem? Okay, so that's kind of, yeah, that's taken me up to about halfway. I guess now, Chris, if you want to just pick up the slides. Here we go. Maybe if this is kind of, Chris, are you still there? Hopefully.
Yep.
Yeah,
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks,
yeah.
Huw, and I appreciate handing it over. I can go ahead and share, actually.
Good.
One moment. And I think everybody can see my screen, hopefully.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, no, thanks for the transition, Huw, and really great points on not only what Curiosity and the team are doing for data generation, really your approach and challenges for both regulated industry and kind of some of these really nuanced things. And I think that it's really important for those who are on the webinar today to really see like a lot of the complexity that test data brings when we start talking about really scalable integration with how we're incorporating in our tests, how we're really thinking about it in terms of test case design. And then the other thing is really, how does this present really challenges, right? When we start talking about regulated industry and high compliance. So I think that's a great segue to some of the areas where we start talking really about test management and really the integration of it. And where you picked up with and left off actually with TestRail, I think is a great kind of segue here to talk about why we really want to look at doing these type of integrations, like taking a little bit of a step back and understanding, not only do we have great tools like Curiosity's platform for data modeler and data generation with enterprise test data, but why do we want to start looking at and leveraging these cross-system integrations and doing things with the data and with these type of data insights that we're going to do to make our test suites better, more robust, compliant, and more reliable, and really giving us more coverage. So why really integrate with test management? Why look at pairing test management integrations with tools specifically like what your team's doing with Curiosity? And there's a couple areas, right? Looking at unification and really unifying activities is really a key kind of core concept with software testing and test management. bringing everything in one platform is really something that TestRail has been, doing since it's been around. And really being able to plan, execute, and track across the testing lifecycle in one place, and really doing the seamless integration of the tech stack, even just beyond manual testing. TestRail, we obviously can consolidate and integrate in a variety of ways for both automated and manual tests. We do a lot of CI/CD based integration as well. But again, the core concept is this concept of really being connected, kind of connected QA across the tooling that you're using. And then more importantly, which is more the focus of today, is really putting your test data at the center of that. How are we going to leverage that? And again, test management and TestRail in this case really provide a great platform mechanism in alignment with our partners at Curiosity, as Huw mentioned, with all the great tooling that he talked about here to kind of give teams that advantage. And it really allows us to scale then with the modern needs for software release and delivery, right? Things are really happening very rapidly. And I've said in my other webinars, this concept of releasing at the speed of testing, right? We don't really want to get into a risk space where we're releasing faster than testing or test data that we have or need to do validations, really gain coverage and get confidence. And more importantly, in the regulated space, maintain good compliance standards, security and quality for what we're working in. We want to make sure we're working in those boundaries. So test management integrations, specifically with platforms and what we're talking about with Curiosity and data, are really critical, I think, when we start getting into these topics. So one of the things I want to kind of dive into here is this idea of parameterization really for execution. Huw gave some great examples of some of the cross kind of platform integration between, Curiosity and TestRail. And I want to talk a little bit about what is really the driver here for this concept of really data parameterization for execution. Like, why would you take a test, for instance, in TestRail, where maybe it's a manual test? I mean, maybe you're even doing things externally for automation. But I'll take an example of a manual test in this case. And why would we want to parameterize that and set it up in a way that we would drive data through that test to optimize really execution and coverage? Right? Because a lot of people, I think, that I see specifically on newer teams or teams that are really growing or just kind of forming, tend to have a lot of duplication, and not only in data sets, but actually on the test side. So tests that have slight variations, teams in many cases will duplicate these test artifacts, either on the automation or manual test side, although it's more common, in my opinion, on the manual test side, where they're making tests that are very, very similar, that we can easily achieve with this concept that I'm calling here is data parameterization, which really leverages and plays well to the tooling that Curiosity is doing, again, for more than not only in the modeler side, but for enterprise test data, on how we can leverage and then parameterize our tests. So what that really means is we can create a test case, and I'll show you an example here when we get to the demo portion in a moment, where we can actually inject or parameterize parameters as part of a test, not as a static piece of data, where we can substitute data values into to test multiple scenarios, but using one variation or one version of a given test case. And why would that really help us, right? Instead of having 6 or 7 test cases that we have to maintain, we can have one test case that is then parameterized, that we can drive data into it to come up with X number of scenarios as the data set grows. And this really gives us a big advantage for test maintenance and test coverage. And it really relies, though, on the quality of the data set that we're going to be using. And again, I come back to what Huw is talking about on quality of data, how we're generating, identifying, and really locking in on a quality data set and a compliant one, right? I heard Huw talk about data masking capabilities. Are we not only getting the right data, the right type of data, but also compliant data that we can use for this type of approach for data parameterization now for execution of tests? So really the key areas here we talk about are getting broader test coverage with the same or really even reduced effort. Using tools like Curiosity, that Curiosity provides, leveraging some data parameterization, which I'll show in TestRail, we can have a single test instance, which then can produce multiple test scenarios and permutations without having duplication of effort and really maximizing our coverage. It also improves the reliability, right? The least amount of artifacts that we have to manage and we can drive data into them is the less amount of rework and test maintenance we're going to do from a team perspective, specifically on manual testing. It has the same impact on automation, but there's also other complexity there. But from that perspective, the more we can use parameterization for driving our tests, the better that's going to be. And then the last one I kind of already talked about here is hard-coded values. They just increase reusability and just durability of the testing you're doing. And that's really for both manual and automated tests. It really helps both. So let's just get in a little bit about the compliance impact on tests and data. And I think Huw touched on multiple pieces of this. And we talk about some industries. And again, TestRail works like heavily in the regulated space. A lot of our customers are in high compliant industries. I think a few months ago, maybe into last year, I did a webinar on testing in regulated industries specifically. And it's really important we talk about specific industries such as healthcare or finance are really unique challenges where we need to drive and parameterize tests in the ways that we're talking about, but we have really challenging data requirements. A lot of healthcare-based use cases want to use patient-based data or field data to have really great coverage for tests in a specific, isolated, and unique domain. A lot of specialized testing happens there, but due to various regulations for us and me specifically in the US, Code of Federal Regulations enforces HIPAA from a compliant perspective. And this is something where we need to mask or really look at this idea of masking or de-identification of data so we can not only be using the right data, but compliant data and not leaking information or not having compliance impact on how and what we're doing. And then at the same time, we want to maintain realism for supporting the coverage and accuracy while doing that masking and de-identification. So it's really a tough thing to do, and it's very hard time consuming to do manual. So leveraging tools like the masking capability that Enterprise Test Data provides and what Huw has mentioned is really a valuable resource when we want to start doing data parameterization for our tests when we're in some of these type of regulated industries. So this way we know that we're not only doing the right testing with the right data, but we're also compliant at the same time. So really important, really be aware of what data you're utilizing and how we're leveraging it for your testing needs. So transitioning here and talking more about this idea of auditing compliance, I think it's also important to note how we can leverage both test management and test management quality of record for our actual executions of our tests for any given system that we're doing validation under. And I think it's really important that people lose track of how important it is for audit and compliance to be able to have a good detailed history of what tests we executed, where they were executed, and actually building this traceability model, not just including data, not just including test itself, but leveraging compliance for the tests and the data we're running together to identify changes, track artifact traceability, look at various versions of a given test or tests. You'll notice this example here on my screen that talks about some validation, log-based validation, and we have some visuals here that show field-to-field level changes. As we modify testing inside of test management, we get the ability to track what has changed in our test cases and how version to version that's impacted what we're trying to test. So this is really a critical area, I think, for not only using test data and aligning with our tests, but having good audit and compliance for the tests and the data that we're using to actually run against our given system under test or infrastructure that we're trying to validate. So kind of coming up before we transition and hand it back off to Huw and myself for some demos, I want to talk about all this leveraging of data and analytics that we're now looking at once we now start to build good parameterization of testing, have a good source where we can model and map and create great test data, right, in platforms like Curiosity and what Huw has described. Looking at now we're integrating with test management that gives us a really good view on how we can track and really have good traceable testing for the parameterized tests that we used, integrated with the data sources. And now we're running these tests against a given release, milestone, and goals that we want to actually run, execute, and validate tests to gain release confidence. Once we do these things, keeping centralized test management and integrating this in one place, this is really the end result or payoff, in my opinion, of why a lot of teams get the most out of leveraging a platform like TestRail, is we can do really great reporting and analytics. So in this case, there's a couple different areas where when we centralize data, it allows us not only for manual testing, but automated tests and taking good test data, meaning data that may be generated, again, outside of coming out of the Curiosity platform, could even be test cases as part of the modeler integration that Huw showed. Once we have all these things in the same place, it really gives us a good opportunity to highlight our release risk and really get on-demand status summaries and reporting. TestRail recently just added a new cross-project reporting feature, which is the screenshot I'm showing below. And then this is a great status breakdown. And this is just like from a sample like website application, marketing website application that shows across products and projects how our test breakdown is being shown, to give you a kind of a visual graphic of pass, fail, untested, or blocked status that really shows you the landscape of how testing and quality are looking across projects or project areas, however you want to decompose them. And it really identifies these gaps in traceability and test coverage as well. Doing deep integrations in test management allow you to see these gaps where normally separate testing, manual in one tool, automated in another tool, and then managing your test data in another tool that maybe is not integrated or very comprehensive. These type of things really don't make it easy to expose gaps in both traceability and coverage, but bringing them together in one platform really maximizes that. And then the last thing here is what I would have talked about in this report is looking at test execution trends and even defect rates. Where am I increasing my defect discovery rates? What does my test execution look like? Where do I have gaps? And where do I have good trends of good quality? So reporting and analytics is really a key part and brings together this really concept of integrated or connected QA that we're doing at TestRail and really leveraging with platforms like Curiosity to give end users the most out of the system. Sure. I'll just jump right into it then. So I talked about in my slides this concept of TestRail data and integration of data sets, and this idea of leveraging test data for execution, right? Parameterization is really a big deal because we can get like a lot of leverage out of how we're setting this up. So Huw talked about the one piece of TestRail integration, kind of using our native integration for modeler going and doing test case creation. And the other one that I did want to show, and it directly relates that generation of test data, as Huw was showing also, of how we can leverage this in TestRail using our concept of data sets. Okay, we call them data sets. And our test data sets there's a module within TestRail that allows you, and I'm using a very simple example, a very scaled down example for this, but they can be as complex or as simple as you like. And basically what it allows us to do is TestRail provides a platform where you can import a CSV file. So for instance, you can export from CSV and get the data that you've generated and architected from the Curiosity platform. We can import this as a CSV file into TestRail and allow us to now come up with a data set that we can use to then parameterize inside of our test executions. Okay. So for this example, I did a really very basic one. I said, maybe I'm going to do something around system validation or login. That's just a really easy use case to kind of visualize. And we're using a username and password as a variable or attribute. I'm defining some default values And then in this case, I have some variation of valid scenarios. So I have a scenario 1 where I have Joe test user as a username, Joe password as a password. And then maybe valid scenario 2 is Joe test user X and Joe password X. And then these may be variations of length or any combinations that we want to drive for valid scenarios in this kind of contextual like example that I'm giving, right? So once we've defined these, so this could, again, be done manually or ideally using a tool or platform to come up with a rich data set like what Curiosity is offering. And if you have to mask or de-identify values, this also is where it comes into play, because we would not want to import data that would be potential go against compliance, right? So we want to maintain compliance for the validity of the data we want to use. So once the data is inside of our data set, we now have this stored. How can we leverage this inside of TestRail? So when we're constructing our test cases, I've created a test case in my test case library here. I call it dataset login. We have the ability, and I'll just show you what this looks like, and then I'll show you what the execution does. We have the ability now to leverage. So for instance, on one of these test steps, you'll notice here that I have the ability to use parameters to leverage entering a username. Really simple scenario. How can we parameterize and leverage a data set rather than me doing multiple test cases, instead using one test case to leverage parameters to drive that? And you'll notice here, I have the ability to now insert a data set, which I've created, to use the username parameter. And then this will be leveraged to then data drive or parameterize this test case. So once I go and do that, and I've done this with a few basic steps of entering a username, entering a password, I can go ahead and create a brand new test plan, which is essentially an aggregation of the various run parameters or data parameters that we're going to drive from the data sets into the test cases as executions. So I've created a brand new test plan that has two different scenarios. It has data scenario for our login 1, which is used as our first data set, data parameters, and our scenario 2, which uses our second data set, second data parameter. And whenever I click on these runs, this is our TestRail test run object, which executes our user login test. You'll notice here that in the test steps, whenever we go to actually execute these, you'll notice that each of the data parameters are now filled in from the data sets that we actually imported into the TestRail test data portion. So we're using one variety or variation of a test case, and we have two different executions that leverage the substitution of these data parameters with the data sets that we've defined. So we're defining one test case, but we're executing two instances of it with two separate test data parameters. And this is really how we want to maximize this concept of test data parameterization for execution. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to, let me stop sharing. I believe Mantis. I think we have about 10 minutes for any questions.
Yeah, we've got some good questions here actually.
Yeah.
So let me pick up one from Marco. How does AI reduce the difficulty of writing test data? Massively. So the problem is, you can go into ChatGPT and say, create me some data, and bingo, you think, great, I'm done. But actually, the problem is that data is pretty much useless in your environment, because it's got to actually match with all the data that exists in your world and all that kind of stuff as well. So there's kind of two different things you need to worry about when you're using AI to create data. One is think of it almost like the business requirements. So here, basically what we've got is, so here within the Copilot, we can actually just go in, drop in textual information, and think of this as building your test cases, in effect. And when I say test cases, in this case, they're all about data. The test cases are entirely about the data states. Most tests are about data. I think probably 5% is UI testing. The rest of it nowadays is data moving around, being transformed within message layers and things like that. Okay. Once you put that in, that is going to build you a model. Those models immediately come from AI, and these in effect are the different potential variations. Obviously here we've got it on a sale day, yes or no. A sale day obviously is a data thing, set insurance cost. This is, end of the month, so yes or no. If it is the end of the month, then obviously, we would set that as a data scenario. So that's kind of one way of doing it. Now, the other way to think about it is actually down in the plumbing, and that's where you're actually trying to create more sophisticated data at the sort of technical level. And if you look at, I'll just quickly, I won't beat this one today. Sorry. So here, sorry, this was the screen here, which I was just where we've got textual information, and that then gets converted into, in effect, a model. And each one of these models, in effect, is a description of the data variations that you get, which again comes back to coverage, which comes back to TestRail, which would then feed into the parameterization, etc. Now, when it comes to the actual generation of the data itself, what you need to do is you need to map, for example, that. Or we're pushing some data into a database, or we're looking up some data, etc. Then what you're really looking at there is in effect something down at the kind of lowest level. And under those circumstances, here what we're up to in this world is you can in effect say, I need to spy some customers, and on those customers I'm going to put in some notes, and I can basically put notes in, and those notes would then be used. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. I need the generation rule set. Excuse me, wrong one. This one. And within those, you can basically just add in notes and descriptions, and those notes and descriptions basically then can say, I need a set of random names, but for a group of companies. Now that would translate into a technical set of randomization functions, and then what you do then is you would just apply the AI assistant and apply them across the world to do that. Okay, so there's a lot of scope, but you need a kind of I use the term plumbing. There's kind of a lot of plumbing that you need to kind of worry about to be able to do that beyond the basic stuff that you can get away with Copilot, etc. So that's that one. What are the open source tools you would use?
There is a question there, Huw, for Chris, right? Mm-hmm. So the question, Chris, is: can you, during your TestRail section, can you import the CSV file via the TestRail API, and also can you then pass that data into your automation tool as a data set, so that it's using the same data set?
Yeah, this is a great question, Kerry. You absolutely can do that. So I'll just share my screen just really quickly, and I'll put the link. But basically, what I was showing, I'll just share this. This is on our TestRail support documentation. So TestRail, in addition to having a really fully featured UI for this, the test management portion of our product, we also have a full extensible API. So we definitely support data sets as both an API that allows you to get a collection of data sets, to get a specific data set, and then you can add, update, or even delete a data set. The payload that we will output for this data set specifically is in JSON. So you can leverage that as needed. You can parse it. Some teams leverage this in different ways to data drive both automated tests or to programmatically update, push, remove data sets inside of TestRail. And then you can obviously leverage that with external data sources like the Curiosity platform or anything else you would want to use to then integrate into TestRail. So it's a good question, and it's definitely available. Excellent.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Chris. But I think we are running quite tight on time with only a few minutes left. So with that in mind, I hope that, the presentation today has, showcase a lot of the benefits of integrating Curiosity's enterprise test data platform with TestRail, and a lot was shown today and a lot of questions were asked. So, please feel free to reach out to Chris or Huw, or visit our websites, curiositysoftware.ie or testrail.com, I believe, to learn more. We're super keen to talk more, actually, right? I know we are running short on time, so we can't.
Yeah. So just on the questions, I think if you fire them off to me and Chris, we'll reply
Exactly.
to
Yeah,
them,
we'll get them all categorized, and we'll send up a follow-up email to everyone who's asked a question, answering those questions. So yeah, thank you everyone for attending. It's been a real pleasure. Please, follow us on LinkedIn, connect with us on, via email, follow Huw and Chris, visit our websites. And just to note, all of the recording and the slides, the complete slides, will be shared with you in a follow-up email tomorrow. We'll also get those Q&A questions answered as well. But thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for Huw and Chris for presenting today.
Thanks.
And
thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.